My name is Victor Furman. Some call me the Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. While advanced age is revered by some, very few are in a hurry to get there. Is there wisdom in the ancient practices of Yoga and Ayurveda that will allow us to age with both physical and spiritual health? My guest this week on Destination Unlimited, Victoria Moran, says yoga and Ayurveda are the keys to aging beautifully. Victoria Moran is a longtime devotee of yoga and author of 13 previous books on well-being, compassionate living, and eclectic spirituality. Creating a Charmed Life was an international bestseller, and Shelter for the Spirit and Lit from Within earned her spots on the Oprah Winfrey Show. Victoria hosts the Main Street Vegan podcast, is founder and director of the Main Street Vegan Academy, and a co-founder of Compassion Consortium, and interfaith spiritual center based on the principle of ahimsa. She was, at age 66, voted Peta's Sexiest Vegan over 50, and in her early 70s trained as a yoga instructor and Raja Yoga instructor. Victoria is a frequent speaker and podcast guest based in New York City. Her website is victoriamoran.com, and she joins me this week to share her path and just published 14th book, Age Like a Yogi, A Heavenly Path to a Dazzling Third Act. Please join me in welcoming to Destination Unlimited, Victoria Moran. Welcome, Victoria.
Why, thank you, Victor. I love the idea of the destination being unlimited.
Absolutely. That's what this is about. So, Victoria, please share with our listeners your first act and the events that shaped your path.
I knew from the time I was little bitty that I had been somewhere before this. And my first spiritual experience was before my third birthday. My nanny took me out in the dark of night. And I don't really know why. Probably my parents were having a fight. But I remember being pushed in my stroller and looking up at the stars. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, a place where you can see the stars. And I remember thinking there in that stroller, that's home. And I'm here now. And this is fine. I'm going to do this thing, but it is not home. So I've always been a little bit odd that way. This nanny pushing the stroller was also a really interesting woman. I call her my first guru. She had studied Rosicrucianism. She'd been in Christian Science. By the time I came along, she was in Unity and had mellowed out a little bit, but still raised me on reincarnation and the idea that all religions are really trying to get people back home. And that whenever there was the idea of our scripture is better than yours and our guy is better than yours, it's really because people just haven't opened up to the oneness of life. So I was very fortunate to have that upbringing early on. And I discovered yoga at 17. I'd already tried to read Christian mysticism and some other things and very interested in all of this stuff. And then yoga really, really touched me. I found 3 books in the Kansas City, Missouri Public Library: Yoga, Youth, and Reincarnation by a journalist named Jess Stern, and 2 books by Indra Devi, who was this wonderful, brilliant Auntie Mame kind of Russian woman who brought Hatha yoga, the physical kind of yoga, to the West. And those books were Yoga for Americans and Forever Young, Forever Healthy. Now, I was 17, and so reading a book about Forever Young and reading another one about yoga, youth, and reincarnation may have seemed strange to some people, but for me, it just made perfect sense. We're eternal. We need to know about all this stuff. So that was my introduction. I moved to London on my 18th birthday because that was where everything was happening at that time, and discovered by divine accident Watkins Books, beautiful little new age spiritual kind of bookshop in a lovely little alleyway street called Cecil Court. It's around the Trafalgar Square area. And Watkins completely woke me up. Everything that my nanny had not introduced me to, Watkins did. I found my first yoga teacher there. She had a sign, and we're still in touch. Stella is 99, absolutely beautiful, lives in a third floor walk up. And when I came back from England, I was very involved in Unity. I lived for a time at the Theosophical Society in Illinois, worked in their library. Later, I worked in their publishing house. And then I got very involved in the vegetarian movement, was vegetarian from the time I came back from England, became vegan later, I've done a lot of work in that area, and started writing books. And now, we're at number 14. And I'm still very entranced by the big picture.
Please tell us about your organization, Main Street Vegan
Uh,
Academy.
yeah, Main Street Vegan Academy grew from my 2012 book, Main Street Vegan. And it was kind of a funny thing. I was really wanting this title, Main Street Vegan, because I felt it was a divine title. I'd been at a PETA fundraiser, and they'd showed footage about the things that humans do to animals. And I had already been in that world for a very long time. I had seen images like that before. But for some reason, that night, my heart was extra open. And as you well know, you got to watch out for that, because when your heart is really open, you're probably going to get some kind of divine download. And so coming home in the train, I was kind of lamenting the fact that I wasn't able to just write a check for $100,000, so they could go fix something big. And I just really felt the voice of the divine saying, no, but here's what you can do. You can write a book and call it Main Street Vegan. It needs to have 40 little chapters because people don't have long attention spans anymore. You need to put a recipe at the end of each one. And I'm like, okay, I can do that. I can do that. So we got a publisher, a very nice publisher, Penguin Random House, for the book. But the first time I talked to my editor, she said, we're so happy to have you, but we hate Main Street. It sounds like the Tea Party. So we're, back in the 2011 kind of time frame. And they bought it so they could name it whatever they wanted to. And I was feeling kind of bad about that, but that's how it was. And then I had a miracle. And I do get these. And I think all of us who are kind of on this spiritual path, these things happen. And sometimes I think we're even embarrassed about them because we don't know if they happen to everybody and we don't want to act like we're special or something. I just think it's because we're looking for them. But anyway, my husband and I are walking up Broadway, and there is somebody so famous you can recognize him from the back. You want to guess?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So that was Michael Moore, the filmmaker, and he had liked one of my earlier books. And he said, we need to talk. We need to talk about food, which I was happy to do. So we started talking. And one night in one of our conversations, I was saying, yeah, this book that I'm writing, I wanted it to be called Main Street Vegan. Publisher hates that. He said, no, it's perfect because everybody in America thinks they're Main Street. Let me talk to them. So I had this amazing three-way call with my editor and an Academy Award winner and me, and he talked her into Main Street Vegan, but she had to run it past the higher-ups. And a few days later, when she called to tell me that they had said, okay, that's your title, it was like those little bubbles in comic books. It's like, oh, there ought to be a Main Street Vegan podcast. There ought to be a Main Street Vegan production company. And there ought to be a Main Street Vegan Academy training vegan lifestyle coaches. So we did. And I just set that up. The podcast also happened kind of marvelously as well. And I had been writing really spiritual books. My very first book was about veganism. My second book was kind of about plant-based health and that sort of thing. And my third book was my journey out of food addiction. And the spiritual part was in the front, and the plant-based part was the second half. But after those, I had been writing all in the kind of spiritual, contemporary spirituality world. So I didn't have a huge following in the vegan space, and I didn't know if anybody would come to that first academy, but they did. We were doing it live in New York City then. We had 13 students the first time. And then they started going out doing these miraculous things in the world. And now we're on Zoom. We'll be doing our 37th cohort in 2025. And it's a wonderful experience because people come together with some shared values and and some differences too. Like I think sometimes if you look from the outside in on any sort of movement, like people that aren't vegan and maybe don't know why people would do that, and you don't see that once you get in there, there's all these different reasons. Spiritually and historically, veganism has been all about ethical living. It's been about the animals. And yet there's a big movement in the area in the US now for whole food plant-based living, and this is for health. And then a lot of people are cutting down on or cutting completely out animal products because of the environment. And, we see these things like the fires in California, and it's becoming so, in front of our faces that environmentalism is not a hobby. It's a necessity. So we get people from all different walks of life who want to share the message with others. So that's been going on for quite some time. And if anybody's interested, mainstreetvegan.com.
Wonderful. I was going to ask you for the website. Thank you for sharing that right away. You are, as we talked, a prolific writer, and congratulations on your 14th Age Like a Yogi. It's just about to come out, correct?
Yeah, the 14th. So when are we airing?
We're airing on that day. No, we're airing on, I'm
Well,
sorry, we're airing on the 15th. So it'll
okay,
come out the
well,
day before this airs.
then a brand new book babe, 1 day old. And I really do think of a book launch, a publication date really is like a birth because you don't know putting a book out in the world what it's going to do. Some of them reach a large audience, some of them reach a smaller audience, but just about any book, certainly on this kind of subject matter, is going to touch somebody and change their lives. I'll always remember I did a book talk in, I believe it was Omaha, for a book that I wrote, gosh, 26 years ago, Creating a Charmed Life. And this woman came up to me and said, after I read this book, I realized what I needed to do. I got rid of the abusive alcoholic. I got my GED and I got my kids back. And, if I never did another thing in my whole life, just the fact that I wrote that book so that one woman could read it was worth having a life on earth. So books are magical.
I was just going to say, what does writing mean to you? And do you
Oh,
consider writing a form of yoga?
oh, absolutely. I consider words my currency for this lifetime. And I actually learned recently that there is some sort of, I guess, fairly newly named disorder that they call nonverbal learning disability. And when I read it, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm glad I'm only finding out about this at 74 because I would have gone through life thinking of myself as having this disability, but I think I have it. And people with nonverbal learning disability are great with words. They're very articulate, they can write well, they can speak well, but they tend to be pretty awful at everything else. And that is so completely me. I cannot carry a tune. I'm terrible with technology. I'm terrible with anything mechanical. So bad in math that I took it in summer school so that it wouldn't interfere with my grade point average. And so words are extremely important to me. And even in my spiritual life, I mean, I need a mantra. Now, a lot of people do so beautifully. They meditate watching their breath, or they watch a candle flame and they go so deep and they have such a beautiful, beautiful inner life. I need that mantra. I need some kind of word. And so the upside of that disability, though it might be, is that it's given me a life's work. The 14 books, hundreds of magazine articles, lots and lots of presentations and radio and TV and podcasts. And it's like, okay, I came here, I picked up the words, and thank you, God.
What you just touched upon before about inspiring that woman, and you said if only one person gained something or learned something through your writing and through your offerings, then it's all worthwhile. Your purpose on earth is fulfilled. Do you find that the truth that when we reach out to people, sometimes in everyday life, we may share a kind word, a thank you, a smile, something nice, something kind, and that one act of kindness can change the world?
Absolutely. And I am a big believer in ripples, that you say something nice to somebody and that puts them in a better mood. And so the person they meet on the next block may be in trouble and may actually need some time or some assistance that they might not have offered if they hadn't talked to you first. So we just don't know where all this stuff is going. But I think there is something, a spiritual teacher of mine used to talk about the upward progression of the universe. And I think every time we just step up to the high road, even when it's difficult, as it often is, we're contributing to that upward progression of the universe.
Absolutely. Before we discuss Age Like a Yogi, let's talk a bit about your previous books. Just tell us a little more about Living a Charmed Life, your guide to finding magic in every moment of
Uh,
every day.
well, that is actually the 10th anniversary sequel to the one that I mentioned earlier, Creating a Charmed Life. Sensible spiritual secrets every busy woman should know. So I'm going to talk about them together. In all honesty, Victor, the first one is so much better. You know, life hands you stuff. And when I was writing that sequel, it was in a time of great grief and tragedy in my life. My 16-year-old stepson died of a freak illness, came totally unexpectedly. My husband and I were in LA. James, our son, was with his mom in Toronto. And so I'd already sold the book. I was already in, and I had a deadline, and I had to write it. And so we went up to Woodstock because I thought my husband might heal better outside New York City. But what I didn't realize when we got there was I absolutely can't stand not being in a city. I mean, I just need that city energy. So I was writing that the sequel, The Living a Charmed Life, in grief in a place that I didn't resonate with. So it's not what the first one was, but Creating a Charmed Life, which I it was actually it's my best-selling book. I think it's sold maybe more than all my others put together. People love that little book. It's the idea that I looked at my own life, and even though I was pretty young when I was writing it, I would have been 45, 46 when I started it, finished it when I was 48. But my life had not been all that easy, but it had been so magical. Just little things. I mean, I hadn't had my Michael Moore story yet when I wrote that, but I met one of the Beatles managers in an elevator in Chicago. And a year later, Paul McCartney was buying me a drink in London. I
Hmm.
mean, it's like, what? Excuse me? How does this happen? And there was so many serendipities and just ways to move through life in the way that I would have painted it if I could have painted and if I could have predicted the future. So I just wanted to help other people have some kind of sense of how even on in our lives that can be difficult and we can run into all these problems, that there can still be this magical thread that kind of lifts us above the problems and makes extraordinary things happen. So, my very favorite of the 75 little essays in Creating a Charmed Life is one called Play Your Free Square. So, Victor, have you played bingo?
Yes.
Okay. Well, anybody who's ever played bingo knows that in the middle of the bingo card, there is a free square. It's just as valuable as B17 or O59, but you don't have to do anything to get it. You don't have to be lucky. You don't have to be smart. It just comes with the fact that you've got a bingo card. Well, life is like that bingo card. And each and every one of us has a free square. Now, this could be a talent. I think it's a little more subtle than that. So I've talked to you a little bit about me. So I would say words are my talent, writing and speaking, but my free square is running into people. Like we talked about the Beatle manager and Michael Moore. And so if you look at your life, like what do I just slide by on? What just happens to me like, oh my gosh, that doesn't seem to happen to most people. And if you can't come up with your own free square, then ask the people around you because they see it. It's like, oh wow, that he's always in the right place at the right time, or she can talk her way out of anything, or whatever it is. And this free square, I truly believe it's like a stepping stone that gets us closer to where we need to be in our life, practically and spiritually.
Absolutely. My guest is Victoria Moran. Her new book, Age Like a Yogi, A Heavenly Path to a Dazzling Third Act. Victoria, please share with our listeners where they can get your books and find out more about you and your wonderful work.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, the books are available wherever books are sold. And I have, I mentioned the mainstreetvegan.com website. That's for if you have an interest in that sort of thing. My Main Street Vegan podcast is there and the Academy. But my author website is just my name, victoriamoran.com. And there's all kinds of stuff there about this new book, Age Like a Yogi, all the other books. I even have something that I think is fun, like a photo album. Like, this is me with my family and animals and people maybe you've heard of. And it's just kind of fun. So thanks
Wonderful.
for stopping by.
Wonderful. And we'll be back with more Victoria after these words on the Om Times Radio Network.
Free your mind with Om Times Radio, IOM FM. Om Times Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. Om Times, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Victoria Moran, her new book, Age Like a Yogi, A Heavenly Path to a Dazzling Third Act. Victoria, many of our listeners are boomers and have reached the third act. What inspired that new book, Age Like a Yogi, A Heavenly Path to a Dazzling Third Act?
Well, I suppose I've been interested in aging all my life. I talked about those early yoga books that had aging as a component, but I think also because I was largely raised by a grandmother age person. This nanny that I talked about, Dee Dee, was, I think, 56 when I was born. And in those days, that was starting to get in the older reaches. And so I just always felt a connection to older people. And then when I turned 50, I was very surprised that of physical changes that happen around that time of life. And my first thought at that time was, well, what can we do to make these not happen? In other words, how do you stop the tide? And I think when we first realize that we're no longer young, we start thinking about, well, how do I look? Like there was a popular book about 20 years ago called How Not to Look Old. And yeah, and I remember thinking, it's like, well, okay, but don't you really want to have, more youthfulness internally? But yeah, I was really interested in that midlife period of what was going on and how to approach that. Did a lot of research on that. Wrote a book called Younger by the Day, back when I thought you could get younger. And so it's been certainly an interest, and time has progressed since then. And I've always had role models who were older than I am. And some of them I've never met, certainly celebrities that are just so cool. You've got Jane Fonda and Cher and Dolly Parton. And even when we were all younger, I would look to people of past generations. There was a wonderful star of silent films, and then a lot of people know her for Sunset Boulevard, and that was Gloria Swanson. When I first moved to New York in 2000, somebody had given me the phone number of a man in his late 90s who had played the organ in silent movie houses in his youth, and he knew Gloria Swanson well. And he told me that even at the end of her life, she always looked flawless, and she would always wear white gloves because her hands were the only part of her that showed any age. So I found these people really fascinating. And then as I started looking at those kind of closer to home and women who had influenced me, mostly women, some men too, but being a woman, I was looking more at them. And one of them that I write about in the introduction to Age Like a Yogi was a woman named Iris White, who was worked in our library sometimes when we needed extra help. She was a longtime theosophist, longtime spiritual seeker, and she would come in and she would just bring this light. There's that wonderful line in Wordsworth, Trailing Clouds of Glory. I mean, here's Iris, and she was late 70s then, white hair up on top of her head, lines in her face, certainly. There was no mistaking her for somebody 30 years younger, but she had this glow. And I remember meeting her when I was 20, thinking, wait a minute, I'm young. I'm supposed to have the glow, but this person in her 70s has it. And that's when I really started to make a study of what is it that causes somebody of any age to just seem like they are, to name another one of my books, lit from within. And Iris was certainly one of those. And there were other people through my life. And then I started thinking about my yoga teachers. And my first yoga teacher, when I moved to London, I started taking asana classes. And of course, in Age Like a Yogi, we talk about asana in one chapter, because this is about yoga philosophy, the inner side of yoga, and also Ayurveda for health of the physical body. But when I went to Stella's classes, I think she was in her 40s, and she just seemed like she knew everything. I was so in awe. I became like a daily student. And then for many years in between, I lost her. I couldn't find her. I would go to London occasionally and I couldn't find her. And I ultimately thought, oh my goodness, she must have met an untimely demise. But then when I was in London about 10 years ago, through the magic of social media, there she was. So we've reconnected. She's 99. She has a salon in her apartment, in her flat, every Sunday morning. And the only rule is no censorship. She teaches a yoga class every week. It's chair yoga for older people, but my goodness, she's 99. And so as I looked at people like that, and I thought, these are people who have been working on their inner lives and also their total well-being, physical health, and inner growth for a long time. And in many cases, not all, this is Earth, it's often inexplicable. We don't know why some people live long and prosper, and other people who seem to be doing everything right have something else happen. And yet, in so many instances, these people who had been very actively involved in their spiritual lives for a long time seemed to infuse the physical body with a little bit of that spiritual longevity. And if we believe that the spirit is eternal, then just a whiff of that, it seems to me, can do quite a bit for the body. Thus, age like a yogi.
Absolutely. You share that we are expressions of God. Please explain and how this understanding is so important, especially in our golden years.
Whether you believe that God made you and you are loved by God, or whether you believe that you are an expression of this divinity by whatever name you want to call it, the it's the same in a way. I realize people like talking about the fine points of religion and spirituality, but in the big picture, either one of those means that in your heart there is this tremendous love. And the way that I see it, and all this, of course, is a working hypothesis, but from yoga philosophy, the idea is that that same light, that same divinity is in each one of us. It's also in other than human beings. It's this great connection of all life. And when you get that, several things happen in terms of aging. One is, oh my gosh, there's this internal part of me that doesn't age. So I'm going to relate more to that than to this changing physical exterior, which has changed and will one day no longer be here. But for now, I am going to relate to that divine within. So that's pretty magical and wonderful. And the other thing that happens when you really get it, that you are divine, it's like you're lifted up from what's going on and you're steered from within. So you talked about serendipities. And I think that this being steered from within helps you have more of those. It helps you make the right split-second decision. It helps you know which road to take. If, for example, you run into a health challenge and there's more than one way to proceed, I find it so fascinating in the medical world that they will say, well, here's what we could do. What do you want to do? It's like, wait a minute, the patient isn't supposed to know all that. And yet, the patient living in this body, which is steered by the divine, may know more than anybody. And to really be able to just go within, make the right decision on some of these important things. And I think finally, too, just knowing that there's more going on here than, okay, you showed up, you grew up, you had a career, you had your kids, you'll be leaving. That just doesn't seem like enough. And so once you get it, it doesn't seem like enough because it would not be enough. We have this wonderful sense of, oh my gosh, there is something cosmic going on here. And that gives you this sense of youthful wonder and expectation. And people can be old at 35 when they are just in this idea that, oh, it's the same old, and I missed out on opportunities, and nothing's ever going to change, and nothing's ever going to be any better, nothing really means anything. Well, my gosh, that person's 110 and they've barely gotten started.
You had shared about having these encounters or learning of seniors who had tremendous wisdom to share. In my late 30s, I was attending a series of salons in Brooklyn on Friday nights, gatherings of people. And the woman who was holding these was well into her 80s at the time. And she would bring in speakers on various spiritual topics. And one evening, the speaker that she had, I just didn't resonate with what that speaker was sharing, and she recognized this. And as the evening was breaking up, she asked me to stay behind for a minute, and I did. And when everyone had left, she had come over and she had taken my hands and looked in my eyes like a mother and said, "Victor, I want to share something with you." She said, "God does not require that we be holy, but God would love for us to be whole." When she
Oh,
said that, it changed my life.
ooh,
It was the
that's
beginning of the
wonderful.
reopening of my spiritual path.
Wow. Wow.
Absolutely, absolutely. What are the three doshas, and
Oh,
how do they reflect in our lifestyle and our health?
yes. Well, now we're moving from yoga to Ayurveda, and most people are a lot more familiar with yoga, and there's a reason for that. That the British, when they colonized India, knew as colonizers that they didn't want to mess with people's religions. Now, yoga is not a religion. You can be a yogi and be a Jew or a Christian or whatever you are, or no affiliations. And certainly you can be Hindu. That grew up, alongside yoga. Yoga is kind of under that umbrella of the Sanatana Dharma that people would refer to as Hinduism. But yoga doesn't have the religious aspects, gods and goddesses and things like that. Yoga is a practice. But the British still saw it as a religious practice. So they left it alone, along with all the other religions and practices flourishing in India. But as colonizers, they wanted to get rid of cultural practices and bring in their own cultural practices. So they brought in Western medicine and they outlawed Ayurveda. So while yoga started being filtered into the English speaking world early on, the British went there in the 1600s. So certainly by the 1800s, there was a lot of interest in yoga in the West. But Ayurveda was still outlawed until 1947. So we've heard about it a lot more recently. And a lot of people think of yoga as a physical practice. It's got some kind of spirit, something behind it. But yoga is a spiritual practice, and the asanas, the downward facing dogs and the headstands and all that stuff, that's one aspect. And actually, a lot of people would say it's a minor aspect of yoga as a whole. Now, Ayurveda is definitely physical. Ayurveda was developed in the Vedic period by these wise people called rishis, and many of them brought through spiritual wisdom, the yoga masters, but there were also some who were getting information about science and physiology. And it's not science the way there's Western science with experimentation and hypotheses and all that sort of thing. But it was very close observation of nature and human physiology, anatomy, and functioning. So, Ayurveda is a health system recognized by the World Health Organization as a viable health system. It has all the components that Western medicine has. It's got psychiatry and gerontology and obstetrics and all the rest. But it also has a huge self-care component. So that's what I talk about in Age Like a Yogi. And sorry for all that long intro to get to your question. One of the concepts in Ayurveda is the idea of doshas, and these are three energies. And all of nature can be identified by one of these doshas. So every season has a dosha, a time of day, the periods of our lives. So they're called vata, pitta, and kapha. In addition to the way that they influence the seasons and the times of day, each of us has a doshic pattern that is imprinted upon our DNA at the moment of conception. And everybody has elements of all three, but we're not striving to have 33 and a third of each one of them. what we're striving to do in our lives as we take care of our health, as we take care of our physical being, is to remain as close to whatever doshic setup we had at that moment of conception. So I don't want to lose anybody. And I know this kind of gets a little bit harried. You can take a quiz. You can take a dosha quiz. The one that I like is it's an online store. I'm not an affiliate. I have nothing to do with them, but I just like their dosha quiz. It's called banyanbotanicals.com. They have a really good dosha quiz there. And it asks you questions, and it asks you a lot of questions that are kind of similar more than once to really get an indication of what your doshic makeup is. And the doshas reflect the 5 elements. And so every person is going to have this way of being in the world based on their primary dosha. So most people, when they're young, are, even though your dosha itself doesn't change. So say for example, you're 60% vata and 30% kapha and 10% pitta. That's you, that's who you are. But in your childhood, kapha is going to have more of an influence than it will in the rest of your life. Kapha is fleshy, and it's a slow-moving dosha, so serious illness is uncommon, except for kind of respiratory things, which we know that kids get. So that's the kapha period of life. Regardless of your personal doshic makeup, everybody until they're about 18, 20 has a lot of kapha influence. And then as we come into the midlife, there's a lot of pitta influence. And pitta is executive functioning, it's energy, it's building stuff, it's getting things done. So when I think of a pitta, they're a politician, they're a public speaker, they're an executive, they're a firefighter, they're somebody out there really making things happen. And if you think of the time of life between like 20 and 60, a lot of that is called for because we're supposed to get an education and get a career and get a home and start a family and take care of our aging parents and do all of these kind of executive sorts of things. But then when you come into later life, and there's a little bit of disagreement about just when this starts. Some people will say right around 50, 55. But certainly nobody reaches 60 without noticing more vata in their physical being. So vata is air and ether, and it tends to be kind of flighty. So if somebody can remember maybe when they were younger having a really round face, and then they're older, and all of a sudden they don't have a round face anymore. There's kind of this hollow in the cheeks. Back in the 60s and 70s, we used to put brown powder underneath the cheekbones to make them look hollow. But, wait long enough, you don't need any brown powder. They're going to hollow out. And so Ayurveda would say that this is vata. You're becoming a little bit lighter, a little bit more delicate. Vata, when it's out of balance or when it's overdoing, can cause impaired digestion. It can cause joint aches and pains. It can cause coldness. I always wondered, why do so many retired people end up in Florida and Arizona? Well, vata, because the winters just feel colder than they used to. So it's a wonderful, wonderful gift of Ayurveda for people in or approaching the third act to understand about the vata influence at this time. So what it means is that we need to take care of vata. We need to pacify vata. So the great Ayurvedic rule is that if you've got too much of something, you want to add in its opposite. So if vata is a cold dosha, which it is, then you need warm baths. and warm drinks like almond milk heated with wonderful spices like cinnamon and cardamom and nutmeg and poppy seeds. Oh, I mean, that Vata just loves that. Ginger tea is a specific for Vata. Licorice tea, as long as you don't have high blood pressure. In that case, licorice is contraindicated, but otherwise Vata just loves that kind of sweet flavor. And then we've got the the flightiness is brought down by having a regular schedule. And it's really good for everybody to have a regular schedule, but Vata people or people in this Vata time of life really, really need to go to bed at just about the same time, get up at just about the same time, eat meals on a schedule. And if you travel, you want to really be sweet to yourself about giving yourself enough time to get over jet lag, because travel tends to be upsetting to Vata. No reason not to do it. You know, one of the greatest experiences of later life are these magnificent trips that so many people take. But you also want to just know you're going to need the extra couple of days to get back to normal. So, yeah, the doshas are a huge, huge subject, but I think just knowing about Vata in later life is a wonderful, wonderful secret.
My guest is Victoria Moran. Her book, Age Like a Yogi, A Heavenly Path to a Dazzling Third Act. We'll be back with more after these words on the Om Times Radio Network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Victoria Moran. Her new book, Age Like a Yogi, A Heavenly Path to a Dazzling Third Act. In Age Like a Yogi, you say that our time on earth is a rehearsal for enlightenment. What does that mean?
I think I call it an audition for enlightenment, but rehearsal is probably better. I think that, and certainly according to the yogic teachings, we are here to find the truth, to learn who we really are, to remember who we really are. And even in Ayurvedic medicine, interestingly enough, they say the root of all illness is poor digestion. But then when you talk further, they say, well, really, the root of all illness is that we've forgotten who we are. So in auditioning for enlightenment, we're here. We're learning, we're healing, we're helping, we're doing what we do. And even before we come to know that there is a purpose to it, this coming to know our inner self, and in yoga, that's the capital S self that you can also call your divine self, your God self. In coming to know that, we've done it. And in yoga, they have an interesting concept of the Jivan Mukti. And I do want to do a shout out to Sharon Gannon, who wrote the foreword for Age Like a Yogi. She's the co-founder of Jiva Mukti Yoga, named for that. Now, a lot of people believe that you don't get your full inner peace, you don't get to see God until after you die. But in yoga, there's a concept of a Jivan Mukti, and that is an enlightened being who is still on earth, walking around enlightened, doing life, doing their job, having their family, whatever it is, but fully aware. And that's cool. Sometimes I'm in the subway and think, I wonder if there's a Jivan Mukti on this car.
I think there are many, actually, if you look for them and know what you're looking for. You offer some wonderful vegan recipes in Age Like a Yogi. Do you have a favorite that you would share with us?
Well, the recipes, there are just a couple in the book. And then there's a PDF, and I'll give your listeners a way to get that PDF so you can have a whole collection of wonderful recipes. But the the one I want to share, because I have it for breakfast almost every morning, it's called an Indian chocolate shake. And this is a way for somebody like me, little girl grown up there in the Midwest, always had a weight problem. The idea that I could grow up and be in my third act and get to have a chocolate shake most mornings for breakfast is just more than I could have ever dreamed of. So what makes this an Ayurvedic chocolate shake, and it does come from Talia Lutzker in her recipe book, Vegan Ayurvedic cookbook, is the spices. So we know in Western medicine that spices are amazing. The antioxidants, the phytochemicals are just so incredibly healing. And Ayurveda has been saying that for 4,000 years. So to make this Ayurvedic chocolate shake, you can use any kind of base you want. I use soy milk. You could use whatever works, even water. Couple of dates to make it a little bit sweet, some cacao powder or cocoa powder, and bananas. And being Vata, I don't want to do frozen bananas because they make me too cold. So I just use room temperature bananas. But somebody who really likes cold smoothies, do 1 or 2 bananas and they can be fresh or frozen. Just be sure that they're ripe. And then here's where the magic comes in. We're going to add spices. And you're safe starting with a 1/4 teaspoon of the really pungent ones like clove and allspice. And you can go up to more like a 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon and nutmeg and some of these, kind of sweeter, milder spices. It's also recommended that you put in some ginger, a little bit of fresh ginger or like a 1/4 of a teaspoon of powdered ginger, because that's very balancing. It's great for digestion. It's really, really good for Vata. And just whiz it up in the blender, and it's wonderful. It's like getting to have breakfast at a soda fountain. And one of the cool things about it is, even though it can be like room temperature, and I'll have it in the morning, room temperature, and I'll have some ginger tea or some licorice tea with it. And then if it's cold out, I go outside and I feel really warm because those spices have warmed me up. So that one's fun.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, and shall I give if people want the PDF, which has the recipes, which giving you a little bit of insider information. The recipes were going to be in the book, but the book got too long. So the recipes are now not in the book, but they're great recipes. So if you just send an email to assist, ASSIST, at victoriamoran.com and just put recipe PDF in the subject line, you'll get that.
Wonderful. Thank you for that generosity. That's wonderful. Thank you. What would you like your readers to take away from Age Like a Yogi?
I would like them to take away hope and promise. And sometimes life can get really, really hard. It can get really hard at any phase, but I think in the later phases, there are a lot of challenges that are unique to this time. I remember in the story of the Buddha that he was this privileged young man who had never seen the outside world outside the palace. And he, I think, bribed a driver to take him out. And he was shocked to see suffering. And what is specifically described, he saw poverty, sickness, death, and old age. And I remember when I heard that, well, wait a minute, I can get it why poverty, sickness, and death are things you don't want to get too close to. But old age, why does everybody want a long life if old age is so terrible? And I think it kind of took getting here to come to see that it's a different phase of life. And it's new, and it can be disconcerting, and you don't know what you're going to get. And so old age is very different for different people. Some people are very healthy into their 90s, healthy centenarians. Other people are not. And one thing that I definitely would never want to promote is this health shaming of, oh, well, what did they do wrong? This is Earth. Things happen. And so even though we can do wonderful things to help hedge our bets, to have better health and longer life and disease prevention, ultimately, we're not in charge of the things that happen to us. So to answer your question, what I want people to take away from the book are some wonderful tips and hints and hacks for living better and feeling better. But underneath that, this deep understanding that each and every one of us is important, is here for a purpose for as long as we're here, and is, in fact, that divine light. That's us. Who are you? You're Victor. I'm Victoria. Yeah, okay. That's true for the moment. There'll be a time when there won't be a Victor or a Victoria, but that light that we are is eternal and perfect. It's with us now, and it's us forever. So if people can just get a whiff or a glimmer of that, then I'll be real happy they read my book.
The Wisdom of Victoria Moran, her book, Age Like a Yogi, A Heavenly Path to a Dazzling Third Act. Victoria, one more time, please share with our listeners where they can get your books and find out more about you.
Thank you so much. The book is at your favorite bookstore, online or in person. And the website is victoriamoran, MORAN.com. Thanks so much.
Victoria, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your experience, your wisdom, and your wonderful sense of humor, too.
Thank you, Victor. It was a pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Furman. Have a wonderful week.